We will be starting the webinar shortly. We'll be starting the webinar shortly. People are still gathering, but I'll start the conversation and then we'll get into the panel. I would like to welcome all of you to the Stand Against Injustice Lunch and Learn series sponsored by the YWCA, along with our sponsor, the Nissan Foundation. We're so thrilled today to have this wonderful panel that's very timely given where we are as a community. We have these lunch and learns because we like to bring relevant topics to the community about, we used to call it the Stand Against Racism, but it's really an injustice issue that's even broader than the issue of racism. And today's topic is Redrawing Democracy. And it's very intentional that we have that title. While people are gathering, I'll tell you a very short story that really resonated with me, and one of the reasons I have this topic. A few years ago, my mother got her heavenly wings, and she was 91. And her first job out of college was in a little town of Augusta, Arkansas. And my mother grew up thinking, because she was empowered by her parents to be a very strong woman, and she went to vote. They told her she'd have to pay a fee to vote. She inquired why, and they said because she didn't grow up there, she didn't live there, she didn't own any property. They also told her she had to answer a few questions. She did notice that white counterparts who were there for different various business reasons, who did not have family there, didn't grow up there, weren't paying this fee. And so I told her, I said, well, Mom, you paid a poll tax. And she said, you know, that's what that was. So there have been a number of ways in which we as a country have fought to deny what was given in the Constitution, was the right to vote. Now, the Constitution was a little tricky. It started off with just white men of age 21 to own land. Then we had certain, rights that were given after Reconstruction to certain, allegedly given to certain people of color. Then we had women that got the right to vote. But at the bottom of that ladder were always Black citizens of the United States of America. And even to this day, one of the reasons we're having this conversation is there are mechanisms in place that are trying to deprive people of our community with the value of their vote. Even though you might be able to vote, your ability to vote and the value of your vote can be diluted because of what we're going to discuss today, which is gerrymandering. Now, redistricting should be a process of redrawing districts to determine how citizens will be represented by government. Let's say if we gave it the benefit of the doubt, the process, it would amplify democracy by ensuring that every citizen has an equal opportunity for elected officials of their choice. However, when you have gerrymandering being used as a tool to deny the fundamental constitutional right to vote, is where we need to have more conversations. I am absolutely thrilled at this panel today. We have Dr. Sekou Franklin. He said just call him Sekou, but I'm going to call him Dr. Sekou Franklin because he deserves every bit of that title. Chicoya Gallman, who is an attorney in Nashville, and She Warrior, that's why I call you, Tequila Johnson, who is here to talk about this because these are people that can educate our community. As I say at the YW, we invite everyone to the table. We don't indict you, but we want you to listen and learn from the experiences of those that we bring here. So here are experts. First of all, before we get started with the first questioning, I would like for each to introduce themselves to our audience and tell a little bit about yourself. I'll start with you, Sequoia.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Chicoya Gallman. I'm an assistant district attorney here in Nashville. I serve on the board for the Tennessee Alliance for Black Lawyers and the Napier Liberty Bar Association. It is through the Tennessee Alliance for Black Lawyers that we attempted to pass a law to remove some voting restrictions, primarily the child support requirement for to get your voting rights back and voting rights IDs. We try to have it where students can use their college IDs to vote. That was unsuccessful, of course, in Tennessee, but that is how I grew interest or more interest in voting rights and understanding the importance of Black and people having the right to vote.
All right, Dr. Franklin.
Greetings. Thanks for having me. Thanks for your leadership, President Robertson. My name is Sekou Franklin. I'm the professor at Middle Tennessee State University, but I live down here in Davidson County. I served as a redistricting coordinator for the Tennessee State Conference of the NAACP. Part of that comes out of my training on redistricting that dates back to the 2008, 2009, 2010 cycle. As part of that larger kind of background, I have a strong interest in voting rights, both historically, going through a lot of archives, thousands of pages of archives of voting rights campaigns from Mississippi to Alabama to other places. But also, I also have authored expert reports for voting rights cases here in Tennessee, from Tennessee, Louisiana, and also North Carolina. And I teach voting rights. So I have a kind of a passion for voting rights at multiple levels. And I want to thank you for inviting me, and thanks to all the panelists and the freedom fighters out there.
All right, Tequila Johnson.
Hey, Sharon, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the panelists for being a part of this conversation as well. My name is Tequila Johnson. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Equity Alliance. I like to call myself a community organizer, a voting rights activist, AKA Mouth of the South. A lot of the work that I do stems from just being on the ground, talking to everyday people, getting people engaged and organized in the civic process, and then seeing how gerrymandering and the lack of voting rights impacts our communities, in particular, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, and communities of color. So my work is all about being on the ground, getting people organized, getting people to see politics as a weapon in the fight for social justice. And a lot of that stems from civic participation and civic engagement, which, as you guys know, and as we'll discuss more today, has been impacted greatly and tremendously by a lot of the voting rights laws that we see coming down, in particular gerrymandering and the attempt to redistrict.
All right, I'll go back to you, Ms. Gallman. We, in 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, of course. What is the significance? And really, if you think about it, we had a constitution, everything seemed okay. Why did we even need this? What's the significance of the Voting Rights Act of 1965?
So if the story she started out with, there was a lot going on. There were poll taxes, literacy tests, particularly for Black and Brown people. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 basically pivoted those race-based discriminations for voting rights. If you ask my grandmother, she says that didn't solve the problem. That was just a step in the right direction. And kind of like Ms. Johnson said, there are laws that continue to be passed that are basically gutting the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Right. Dr. Franklin, you know, the Voting Rights Act specifically has a section that deals with racial gerrymandering. Let's talk about this. What's the significance of the 65 Voting Rights Act?
Well, the Voting Rights Act 65 was one of the most top 5, I would say, domestic policy achievements of the 20th century, because it, in addition to bringing millions of people into the electoral process or voting booth, it broke up, at least it tried to break up, it made a step towards breaking up authoritarian local political regimes in the South. And you have to understand that, I can go on about this, but if you wanted to register to vote in Greenwood, Mississippi, or Natchez, Mississippi, more likely you had to go up not just against racialized, extreme racialized political violence, but that racialized political violence was reinforced by the sheriff, by the county commission, state lawmakers, and also by Senator James Eastland, who was also the chair of the Judiciary Committee. So the Voting Rights Act was monumental in expanding the right to vote. And then it was reauthorized in 1970, and that initial reauthorization gave young people the right to vote, later affirmed by the 26th Amendment. And then reauthorized again in 1975, and that 75 reauthorization brought in language minorities, not just, for example, Spanish-speaking persons, but also Native Americans who spoke indigenous languages. And then reauthorized in 82, and that 82 provision in particular had a more explicit reference or a more explicit way of addressing gerrymandering that diluted racial minorities. And then it was reauthorized again in 2006. But with the Voting Rights Act, we're talking about a major step towards democracy. And of course, it's been treated in a very hostile fashion by the courts, which we maybe could talk about later on.
Okay, Ms. Johnson, why is this so controversial? It seems as though what it's really addressing is equity in voting. And we started back the Constitution, even though it was, did excluded a lot over time, the Constitution was addressing all these. Why is this Voting Rights Act so controversial?
Well, I think I'm looking at Dr. Franklin, because I would even argue that the Constitution is controversial, depending on who you're talking to and how they interpret it. But in particular, the Voting Rights Act of 65, a couple of years ago, I testified to Congress about restoring the pre-clearance, as Dr. Franklin mentioned earlier, which was gutted in 2013 in the Shelby versus Holder case. And what the pre-clearance did was put something in place that made it harder for states like Tennessee, Mississippi, most of our southern states where a lot of the KKK regime still resided in office. It made it harder for them to enact voting rights laws without having to go through steps to ensure that they were not racially gerrymandering or treating people differently or drawing a line so that certain particular people couldn't vote. So the reason why I think this is so controversial, in my own opinion, and based off of the work that I've done and the research that I've done, is because there are people who want to make sure that people who don't agree with them don't have equitable opportunity to cast a vote. Why? Because that will take power from them. And so when you think about the Voting Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act was a way of restoring a certain population of people, Black people and indigenous people, people who were omitted from being able to vote in the Constitution. It was a way of restoring power and giving those people a voice. America operates on a democracy. So everything we do, even down to our street lights, the clothes we wear, where we can buy things from, the prices of things are all predicated on what policymaker passes a policy or writes some sort of bill or some sort of a provision that either prevents or does it. And so in my opinion, I think that this is a way of diluting power and keeping and reserving power for a small few and using the Constitution to do that.
Oh, all right. Ms. Gallman, let's go back a little bit. We've thrown out this term gerrymandering. Why is it important? What is it? What are people doing? What's the structural backup? What is gerrymandering? You're muted.
Thank you. Gerrymandering, I think the initial, or basically the description that you gave earlier, I think it can be used in a good way, but here recently it's been manipulated to give a particular party more power, kind of like what Ms. Johnson was hinting at. So the most popular redistricting that we have faced is the one that recently happened in Nashville, where they split a particular district and diluted the power away from Black and Brown communities and gave it to the majority. So gerrymandering is basically redistricting is where they redistrict a district basically that is of a particular race or socioeconomic status, but it can be manipulated, and that is what is most commonly used for, is to manipulate the Black and Brown vote and to take away the power that we have. And just to add to Ms. Johnson's point, I think that people fear the power that Black and Brown people have, and so as we continue to gain that power and we continue to show the unity that we have with minorities, I think that they will continue to use gerrymandering to manipulate our districts to make sure that they still hold the majority.
All right, Dr. Franklin, so we have a structure in which, based on where you live or reside, you vote in that structure for members, let's say, of Congress. Let's talk about gerrymandering. How is that working? Why is that manipulation? What is going on? What is this subject that you're spending your time studying and seeing what's going on, especially the way it relates to the South?
Well, gerrymandering is an old tactic. It's been used by both parties over time, and we're talking about going back to the 19th century. And it's a way of drawing districts often in a manipulated and distorted fashion in order to basically stack the deck in favor of one group, one party, in order to rig the election or really shape the outcome. And it protects incumbents, and it effectively determines who's going to win the election before it happens by drawing these manipulated, weirdly distorted districts. You have two forms of gerrymandering for the purposes of this discussion, maybe three. You have partisan gerrymandering, in which we see taking place all across the country. Really, probably in the last, I would say, 10 or 15 years, you have what I call excessive partisan gerrymandering, which is you see, not to be partisan, but you see Republicans drawing excessively partisan gerrymandered districts. But it's been done on both sides historically, so to be fair. And the Supreme Court has allowed for partisan gerrymandering. So that's also something important to point out. You also have racial gerrymandering, and you can have racial gerrymandering that allows minorities to elect a candidate of choice in areas where they historically weren't able to do that. Or you can have racial gerrymandering that dilutes the Black Latino vote with intent. And the courts have come in, particularly as an attack on civil rights groups, but it can be used overall to not allow for racial gerrymandering. So we have this situation in which we have partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. The courts don't allow for racial gerrymandering, but they allow for partisan gerrymandering. And there are ways in which, and this is where there are ways in which a party can engage in gerrymandering through partisan means, but they're effectively doing the exact same thing that racial gerrymandering does. They're diluting the Black and Latino vote. And that's what you see across the country in these redistricting plans in the last round of redistricting. You're seeing these partisan gerrymandering districts that are drawn across the country. And oftentimes they're under the guise of drawing districts in a partisan way or a political way that's approved by the courts. But in reality, if you kind of peel back the mask, you find that Black and Latino voters are disenfranchised or diluted, or their vote is minimized. I can offer a third way to look at this for Tennessee in particular is for Tennessee state legislative districts, particularly the House. You have another variation. You have House districts that are drawn in Tennessee through what's called excessive county splits, in which the supermajority was able to maintain power by splitting an excessive number of counties in a way that through surgical and targeted procedures, I would argue, stack the deck or at least minimize Black voter participation, Black voters in places like Maury County and Gibson County, in places that are oftentimes not discussed in contemporary discourse in Tennessee. So there's so many different ways to look at this, but yes, it's rigging the game. That's what I want to say. It's rigging the game. That is partisan gerrymandering.
Wow, and see, what's amazing about this discussion is in 1965, specifically, what was it, Section 2 and Section 5 of the 65 Voting Rights Act specifically addressed this issue, and you weren't supposed to, under the law, dilute these votes for certain protected groups, including Black people. But yet we're in 2023 and we're having this struggle. Tequila, help me. What about the racial gerrymandering? Why are we still having this in 1965? That wasn't just yesterday. That was a while ago. In 1965, this was an issue. Why are we still struggling in 2023? 24, actually.
Well, as somebody just said in the chat, the struggle continues. I always tell people freedom isn't a destination, it's a journey, and it's a continuous one. When you get certain freedoms, when you get certain provisions, history has shown us that you have to continue to press forward to protect them. And so I think that what we are experiencing now is a shift in power. And with that shift in power is going to come resistance from both sides of the aisle. And that's not a partisan statement, because there are people on both sides that it doesn't benefit them for Black and brown people to have a voice, whether that be a vote or whether that be able to show up and speak and voice their opinion and hold policymakers accountable. So I think what we are experiencing in terms of gerrymandering in Tennessee is this shift in power. And when you look at Tennessee in particular, which is an ironic fact, and I would love for Dr. Franklin to talk about it because I've wrecked my brain trying to figure it out, why Tennessee was omitted from the Pre-Clearance Act of 65 as the state where the KKK was founded. And I've asked several scholars, and no one has been able to really answer that. So anyway, back to what I was saying, yes, we're at a place where power is shifting. And if you look at Tennessee, Tennessee ranks dead last in everything, including voter turnout. Tennessee is 51st in the nation for voter turnout, and we're somewhere around 49th in the nation for voter registration. We rank at the bottom for schools, mortality, you name it, domestic violence, everything that impacts people's daily life. We just saw all the information come out about TANF and all of the economic issues that we're having in the state for people who are just everyday working class people. And so it draws the question that I would in turn ask everyone who's listening: why are we being racially gerrymandered? Why are Black and brown people being held back from voting in such an aggressive way in Tennessee when we rank at the bottom in everything already? So I would say that's a question that I think we should all wrestle with. But for me, it's all about this transfer of power and diluting certain people's voices.
All right, I'm going to go back to you, Dr. Franklin, because you asked a question to explain something that I would really like to hear about too, about the state of Tennessee.
Well, the question was about pre-clearance, and I
Yeah.
agree with you, Ms. Johnson. I wish we would have been covered by pre-clearance, but Tennessee was in a unique situation because the pre-clearance formula that was established in 65 said that if you came from a state that had a voter registration or a voter turnout rate that was below 50%, then you would be covered by pre-clearance. The assumption was that any state that had that met that litmus test was, and if you had a literacy test, and if you had a literacy test. So any state that had met those requirements, those states were typically in the South. And there were some states that had jurisdictions that had that, but not the entire state. Tennessee was in a unique situation because you had a significant migration of voters, including Black voters, into 3 or 4 areas. Black folks moved to Shelby County, Memphis, Nashville, Chattanooga, Knoxville, and some parts of rural West. Well, Nashville and Memphis, they were controlled by political machines going back to the early 20th century. The Hillary House machine in Nashville and the Crump machine in Memphis, which probably was the most powerful political boss in the South. And those machines managed and controlled Black votes, but it also distorted the ways that Blacks were able to participate. So if you were a Black person in Memphis in 1960 or 1950, you could vote in Memphis, but you can go 30 miles to Fayette County and not vote. But because of this great migration where more than half of the Black folks moved to these areas that were controlled by political machines, that where they could vote, but the vote was controlled and managed, it distorted the voter turnout, it distorted the effectiveness of the Black vote. And that effectiveness was not fully understood by those persons who wrote the Voting Rights Act. And so, from my opinion, so Tennessee was not covered by pre-clearance. But to your point, Ms. Johnson, earlier, even though you had Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, you had a chilling effect in Tennessee, where lawmakers effectively did the exact same thing in Tennessee that they did in Alabama and Georgia: photo identification laws, bad gerrymandering issues, purging of voters. And in fact, Tennessee is probably based, I can go on and on. Actually, Tennessee might even be worse than those former pre-clearance states. If you look at some of the research out there, and I'll refer you to Grumbach's work out of Berkeley, of his state democracy index, Tennessee ranks 50th on the level of democracy. So even though we were not a pre-clearance state, because we typically had this aura about us in this context, we in many respects have faced as much of a backlash, if not more of a backlash, because of some of the things that the panelists mentioned, than even those former pre-clearance states.
All right, well, thank you. Okay, Ms. Gallman, we're really talking about around the edges of the separation of powers. You know, we have the executive branch, the legislative branch, judicial branch. And even though the legislative branch has acted and the executive branch signed off on these laws, etc., this judicial branch has done a lot of things that have changed the nature of how we go about voting in this country. Several civil rights groups have filed gerrymandering suit against Tennessee specifically for racial gerrymandering. Can you tell us more about the lawsuits and their importance?
So unfortunately, I can't personally talk about that. I serve in the executive branch as an assistant district attorney. I should have sent you all an email about that, but I would defer to Dr. Franklin. I apologize for not being able to answer that question.
All right, well, we'll start with you, Ms. Johnson. You'll start, then we'll go to Dr. Franklin.
Yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. I don't want to get into too much of the details because, of course, it's a proceeding case, but the lawsuit against Tennessee is crucial in addressing in challenging the unfair redistricting lines. It is, redistricting, as we have said, can be used as an unfair manipulation of voting power. And in particular, when you look at how the lines were redrawn in Nashville, is a perfect case. We don't have a congressional district in Nashville as of now. We've been split up. And so there are a couple of Senate districts. There are so many districts where it was evident that there were racially biased line drawing that happened. And so I think it's important that as we're talking about these issues of the Constitution and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, we recognize that we have to use all the tools in our tool belt to advocate for fair and just opportunities to participate in democracy. And that also includes challenging things in the courts. Oftentimes when it comes to Black voters, one of the things that I've seen that we often don't see as a opportunity or a pathway to victory is utilizing the courts and suing and holding the state accountable and making sure that they are able to present why these things are the way they are. And so I think that one of the things that is so great about this lawsuit is that with everything that we just learned about the Pre-Clearance Act and all the things we said around gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering, and knowing that Tennessee is at 50th for democracy overall, 51 for voter turnout, it is important that we show that we're going to use all the tools that we have to push back. And one of those tools is taking it to court.
All right, Dr. Franklin, let's talk about this. What are we looking at as far as the lawsuits that are there in order to fight dilution of the vote, basically, is the best way of putting it.
Full disclosure, I think Ms. Johnson knows too, we're involved in a lawsuit, so we're limited in what we can.
Okay, I got it. I understand.
But what I will say is it's a very important lawsuit because, as mentioned earlier, the legislature split Nashville into 3 congressional districts. And if you were to stand in Nashville and look at what Nashville is tied to, those 3 districts are linked now to 1/3 of the counties in Tennessee. So if you're in one part of Goodlettsville, you're in the 6th district that goes all the way, maybe I could be wrong, but the Putnam County. If you're in or if you're East Nashville, the same thing. If you're if you're at Fisk University, you are now connected to rural counties that go to basically to the north and to the west. And if you're in parts of South Nashville, you go past Maury County. And collectively, if you look at where Nashville is the hub, Nashville now is a hub to 30 plus counties. But as Ms. Johnson mentioned, I don't think any lawmaker has a congressional district in the city of Nashville. I could be wrong about that. So all the representation for the city of Nashville are represented by people who are not from or don't live in Nashville. So it's one of the worst redistricting plans that we've seen. And I could be wrong, but I think it is not a Section 2 VRA case. It's a case that relies upon constitutional protections that are embedded in voting rights legal theory, like the 14th Amendment and intentional discrimination and racial gerrymandering, which is part of that as well, and other things too as well. But also the case involves a Senate district in Shelby County, and what I'll say about the redistricting process in Tennessee is for the audience is there's a lot of things that were left on the stove cooking that we could not eat. There was a bad redistricting plan that affected Laverne. Laverne is a majority minority city. That city now is 52% Black and Latino or Latino and Black. That city is now drawn into an area of Murfreesboro. It almost skips over Smyrna. There were local redistricting plans in Fayette County and Covington, Tennessee. There's excessive county splitting that occurred with the House districts that I think really split up Black communities across the state. I think, for those people who are demographers, I'm not one of them, and researchers who want to go through a fine-tooth comb, you're going to find major problems that affect Black voters. And to the point earlier, why does all this matter? Because Tennessee is becoming a more diverse state. The country now, in 1980, the country was 11% non-white voting age population. Now the country's 33 to 35% non-white voting age population. So things have changed dramatically. And I'll say this last thing if I can, and hopefully I can just get 1 minute. As I see it, my own personal perspective, the state legislature was in a bind. They not bind, but they were playing politics in a very narcissistic way, from my perspective. That you had so much tremendous growth in Middle Tennessee. Williamson County may have been 85% white, now 75% white. Even those counties that were literally white have seen more non-whites come into those counties. But then if there's so much growth in Middle Tennessee, but then the power broker counties are Rutherford and Williamson County, then the supermajority in the state legislature, I think, was faced with the idea that they wanted to maintain their power in Rutherford County. Rutherford County got a 5th legislative district, and they wanted to maintain their power in Williamson County. So so the redistricting process wasn't. It was about race. It was about equal protection. It was about growth. It was about non-whites. But I also think that, and I don't know enough about the partisan politics here in the state. Others may know. I also think there was an insider conversation among Republicans about how they can maintain power in both Rutherford and Williamson County, because really, if you want to draw a fair district that encompasses that accounts for the growth of Middle Tennessee, literally you would have had to effect or use redistricting to effect or draw new districts that effect the populations in Williamson and Rutherford County, which are adjacent to each other.
Ms. Gallman, without going into a specific legal case, can you give us a refresher on the role that the courts play in these sorts of cases? Not going specifically, but what's the role of the court? What should courts be looking at?
I think that part of the issue that we've been seeing lately with the courts is that it has also become political. These appointments, serve a certain political party. Courts should take an unbiased approach to these cases. They should decide it based on the law, particularly specifically with Nashville, the redistricting. It did, gut and dilute the vote, which is what the Voting Rights Act, particularly prohibited. So they should look at it based on that and decide it based on the law that they have in front of them. That doesn't always happen because like Ms. Johnson said, it is the transfer of power, and they're trying to get that power back. And so politics is being played even where it shouldn't be played.
Yeah, I mean, that very, very true. Now, we're going to talk about something now that's really, really super scary to me. And this is a recent decision by the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. And this is really getting at the foundation to challenges of violation of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As I said before, there's a section that specifically addresses the issue of racial gerrymandering. However, as we have a concept in the courts of standing, who can sue? The right to sue on this issue. Ms. Johnson, this is saying that organizations such as yours, NAACP, the League of Women Voters, that if this goes forward and is affirmed by the U.S. Supreme Court, then only the Justice Department could bring a challenge to Section 2, and that's the gerrymandering section, racial gerrymandering section of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but this is very traumatic for me to even believe this could occur. But what do you say?
I agree with you. It is very traumatic and, as Dr. Franklin said, very narcissistic. And as Ms. Gallman said, is also a way of controlling power, because what we have also seen over the last few years are organizations like the Equity Alliance, the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, coming together to not only challenge in the courts, but to also build ground power and take people out of their positions and put people in position who agree with the majority of the people in the country, right? The people who want safe schools, the people who want to be able to make a decent living, a decent wage. And so all of this is just a way of stacking the deck. I think that this, at 70 years since the Voting Rights Act of 1865, I think this underscores it. It underscores the ongoing challenges in securing equal voting rights, and it raises questions behind the intent to redistrict. It raises questions around, why are these things being put in place if there are no ill intents on behalf of those who are making decisions on how the lines are drawn. So I think that all of this is something that we have to pay close attention to, and we have to make sure that there are people inside of the building. And when I say inside of the building, I'm referring to people in the state house, in the state legislature, in the different general assemblies across the country. We have to make sure that people on the ground are also organizing, getting people engaged, making sure that everyday people are informed on how this impacts them. And we have to make sure that we have people in the courts challenging this as well. And so it is something that I think we should get prepared for more of this, because as more people are starting to stand up and say, we want to use our voice, we want people who represent us in elected office. The people who are in elected office that want to hold that power are going to continuously push back. And we're going to see more things like this, just like we see with the rights restoration laws that are coming out, the college ID laws, the attack on the vote is not minimized to one issue. It is something that is spread across, and it is a bipartisan fight. Like, people on both sides use these tactics to control power.
Yes, thank you. And Dr. Franklin, here we are, as Ms. Johnson said, we're 70 years down the road, and they're saying, well, these people don't even have the right to sue. And, you know, being a lawyer, I think you can make your case in court. If you can't make your case in court, so be it. That's the system we have. Why is this being attacked, saying that these organizations that have stood with our country, and it's to the benefit of the country, for years, holding up the Voting Rights Act, why is it now they're saying they may not even have the right to sue?
Well, this is the worst of the worst. And I've followed this dispute since a year ago. It was initially came out of a district court judge out of Arkansas, a 40-something, 43-year-old judge who, and if you read I read his opinion a year ago, and it was all within the etiquette of the law. And it would, as you're right, it would prevent an organization from bringing a lawsuit like the NAACP, like Equity Alliance, like Black Lives Matter, or Black Voters Matter, rather, like the League of Women Voters. You can no longer bring a lawsuit unless that suit is connected to a DOJ, Department of Justice suit. You can bring a suit if you're an individual who's an injured party. But, you know, for those persons who've been plaintiffs in suits, it's very risky, it's very stressful, and you could face a lot of repression and reprisals. If this suit had been in place, and it targets Section 2, it targets what is left in terms of the meat and guts of the Voting Rights Act. So if and I believe, well, not just the Eighth Appellate Circuit has affirmed it, but I believe Gorsuch has, at least in a statement or a footnote, I could be wrong, on the Supreme Court, indicated that he might support it. It's the biggest threat to the Voting Rights Act since the Shelby County v. Holder decision, because it would remove the ability of groups to bring lawsuits. And people may say, well, the Department of Justice can bring a lawsuit. Well, the Department of Justice, the willingness to support voting rights is dependent upon who's the president, who's controlling the voting section, who's controlling the civil rights division. And even when Democrats controlled the DOJ, the Obama years, fewer than 20 voting rights suits, I believe I heard the number, were brought by the DOJ. This DOJ under Biden is much more active, but it's impossible for, as an example, in the 2020 and the 2020 election, at least 200 lawsuits were brought, many of which were brought around mail-in balloting. It's impossible for the DOJ to litigate hundreds of lawsuits across the country with the time and the money and the resources. So this is the biggest attack on voting rights, I believe, that we've seen since Shelby County Beholder. And why is the attack occurring? Because groups are resilient. We're resilient. Until our side, until you put us in the ground at 6 feet under, we're gonna fight. It's like you have slavery, but you also, even though you have slavery, the Underground Railroad is moving. We have resilience, we have power. So this is a way to effectively try to put a nail in a coffin, targeting groups that are effective at mobilizing voters and raising issues and around voter access across a broad platform of issues. Voter access when it comes to formerly incarcerated persons, voter access when it comes to mobilizing communities after natural disasters happen, voter access when it comes to redistricting, and on and on and on and on. And I'm sorry. This is the issue I've been angry about for the last 9 to 12 months, because if this makes its way to the Supreme Court, Gorsuch has indicated, possibly through a wink and a nod, that he wants to go to the Supreme Court, then effectively it would eliminate the capacity. It would have, if this were around years ago, it would eliminate the capacity of a Thurgood Marshall.
Yes,
Or eliminate the capacity of the SCLC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, all those flagship groups to bring voting rights suits in very hostile areas. And so I want to emphasize this point. And if I can make one more point to that too.
Take your time. This is good.
Sorry, we're not just talking about Blacks and voting rights. One of the biggest efforts that's been made around voting rights has been in the Native American community. And I followed this quite closely. Native American groups in Arizona, in the Dakotas, in Montana, in the last 30 years have brought cases around redistricting, cases around residency requirements, cases around access, around language. You want to look at Arizona, which was decided by fewer than 15 or 20,000 votes, right? Go to the work that Native American groups did in Arizona to mobilize voters. So we're talking about an attack not just on traditional civil rights groups, but marginalized groups that are at the very extreme levels of poverty and ability to challenge cases. So I'm sorry, I'm very passionate about this, because this more than anything has just caused me to be so angry about the hostility of the courts towards voting rights.
We'd love to have this passion. This is what people need to hear, because when you have passion with a purpose, that's how you get change. I will say this, I was talking to a woman about how the United States, if we could ever move toward meritocracy, which has not happened, we could have a better country. And she's always asked me, that's one thing I truly believe, but we're so far from that. But she was saying, what can I do? And there's actually a group of well-heeled women that are getting together tomorrow evening to talk about these issues. And how can those who are attendees, because I know some of the names that are here in the chat are people that really want to see substantive change. And some of these are I call them my old school feminist friends, who came up during the era where women had to ask their husband for $1 to get, to go to the grocery store. And so they understand the injustices that exist and how your rights can be taken away. How can the attendees be a part of the work to make sure their voices are heard? I'll start with you, Ms. Gallman. Just trying to get off mute. Okay.
I think my Wi-Fi cut out. I'm sorry, you all. I'm still in court, so I'm in the back room of the courthouse. I think I missed it.
Okay, I was asking, how can those who are wanting to get engaged, what can I do? What's the call to action? What can the attendees of this session do to be part of your work to make sure their voices are heard? What can we do? There are organizations you could join, etc. But what can an individual do if you were speaking to them in order to address some of these concerns, some of the negative things that come about as a result of racial gerrymandering?
I think one of the most important things is to educate. We have this new generation of, I call them kids, they're younger than me, but they are passionate and they want to fight and they want to be involved, but they don't really understand what the issues are. So if we educate that newer generation, get them involved, we can use the power that they bring to help do the groundwork that has been mentioned so often here. I can't do much on my side. I decided to fight from the inside out. So why I got involved in the work, just, I don't want to take too much of your time, but I have a brother who's a convicted felon out of Georgia. He lives in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He cannot vote in Tennessee because he owes the state of Georgia $350,000. Tennessee doesn't even profit from the court costs and fees that he owes, but they will not allow him to vote. Here's a plot twist. He can vote in Georgia. He could, if he lived in Georgia, he could register to vote in Georgia. So that's why I got involved. And so I decided to fight from the inside out. I try to make people aware of how you can get your cases expunged. You know, I'm very involved in, or I lead the Safe Surrender event for our office to help people get rid of nonviolent warrants that they may have. So that's how I fight from the inside out. But then I also try to do as much as I can through the NAACP, through the Tennessee Alliance for Black Lawyers, through the Napier Bar Association, and networking with others. But the most important thing, I think, is educating those that's coming after us, because they're going to have to continue to fight once we're gone.
And it's interesting you brought up those who are, we had a whole session like this on the issue of disenfranchisement of individuals who have been previously convicted as felon. And one thing that came out of that session was what an outlier the United States of America is around the world in that regard. In most countries, once you do your time, you're good to go. United States is very unique, and Tennessee is even a smaller subsection, super hard. But that is something that I think that, you know, you have to look at how the laws were. It's a whole other session, but I'll just say a little bit of this. We had a session on this, was very informative, because what we found out is what an outlier the United States of America is in this regard, keeping people under that, you know, what you did in the past stays with you forever in the United States, a very vindictive, really hateful view of the world. And that's one of the things that I think that we do need to address as a community, as a country. Okay, Ms. Johnson, tell me something about this. What can someone do? I'm well-meaning, I want to help, I want to make change, I don't think this is right. What can I do?
So I'm gonna say this, and I'm gonna stand on it, but this might be a little bit controversial. I think the first, and it shouldn't be, but I think the first and most important thing that you can do is trust. And when I say trust, I mean trust the people who are impacted by it the most to free themselves. And how you free yourself is through empowerment. I think oftentimes when things happen, we see a community and we immediately want to parachute in, and we immediately want to provide support, and we want to change it, we want to fix it, but that does not usually work. There's tons of research that shows when people who are directly impacted by an issue lead that issue, it's more sustainable. And so I think joining organizations that are already on the ground with the relationships doing that work is really important. And there are tons in Nashville. I will definitely be the one to say, please follow, join, support, volunteer with the Equity Alliance, because that's the organization that I lead. But I would also say, don't stop there. If you are really passionate and you have the time, the money, and the talent to invest in this issue, find multiple organizations and invest in them. Find multiple organizations to volunteer with, because it's going to take all of us fighting in order to get there. But I do think if we continue to have a fight that is coming from on the outside, saying it to the inside, we're going to continue to see Tennessee be 51 in voter turnout. We're going to continue to see a lot of people who are impacted by these things be apathetic. Because sometimes it's just important that the people, the most credible messengers are the people who are impacted by it. So I would say trust the people who are impacted by it to take the mantle and push forward in the fight, but then support them as well. Like, support the people who are doing it, and stand up for the people who are doing it. And I would say to people who aren't impacted by those issues, probably the biggest thing you could do is talk to the people who you have relationships with that disagree. Educate them. When you're at the Thanksgiving table and you know that your folks don't really care about this, or they feel like these communities don't deserve to vote, or people who have been impacted by the unjust system shouldn't have their rights restored, have a conversation with them, challenge their thoughts. Because I, as a Black woman, can't go into certain spaces and advocate and challenge thoughts. But if you are passionate about this, you can. I can go and register Black and brown voters. I can go and talk to people in my community who are impacted by it. What I need you to do is support me doing that, but also take your voice and talk to the people in your community who are actively fighting against marginalized communities such as the Black and brown communities.
All right, Dr. Franklin, well-meaning, and I'm with a lot of various kinds of folks in the community, and I'm very consistent, deliberate in my message. You have to look at those organizations that are doing the work, even most anti-gun initiatives that have started. There were people doing this work long before what happened, unfortunately, at the Covenant School. There were some people that were the grassroots that I knew that have been out there fighting this fight for a long time. So I think you really have to look at some of those other organizations. Dr. Franklin, give us some of your wisdom.
Well, I would agree with the other panelists, and you have to believe that you could win. Even you have to be able to see that when others can't see that, and that maintains optimism and hope. I wanted to make sure I point that out. I just finished a Harriet Tubman biography, and she was able to see things of victory when others couldn't see. I do think that the groups that are on the ground doing that are winning communities over through voter registration, voter engagement, turnout, voting rights, street by street, block by block, they do need resources. And the work is very grinding. It can be very you deal with a lot of criticisms, and sometimes you're going into terrain that you may not know. If you're successful organizing in Nashville, anyone here knows you're going to be called upon to help out in other areas. But groups need a lot of resources and money and to build up infrastructure, because movement infrastructures, voting rights infrastructures, voter registration infrastructure, that they do matter, and they do require quite a bit of money and quite a bit of resources and personnel. I think we need to think in Tennessee about legal resources. We only have, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, in terms of people who actually live in Tennessee and who do voting rights work legally on a day-to-day level, like not one of many different issues in their toolbox. We only have just a handful of people who do that, who actually live in Tennessee. And we've seen one or two groups emerge in the last couple of years in which there's some positive signs on. But if you can imagine a state like Tennessee that had one of the most important voting rights movements in tent city and rural West in the late 1950s and 1960s, we're in 2024, and you can count the number of people who do voting rights litigation on one hand, and it's probably by my indication maybe two or three that are doing that. So we need to build up the legal capacity to do that. We need to also have groups monitor the administrative agencies that are responsible for often managing voter access. The DMVs, the social service agencies that should have voter registration, are the local election commissions giving people accurate information, are the criminal court clerks that are responsible for communicating issues around voter restoration, are they giving people accurate information? Is a state election commission. I'm not sure if civil rights groups have actually put people inside to monitor the state election commission meetings. The division of elections, we live in a state where the Secretary of State is not elected, one of the few states like that. And the division of elections and the coordinator of elections in particular, one person has outside extraordinary power to determine the ability to have access to the vote for hundreds of thousands of people, which is what he did with the voter restoration Falls versus Goins case last July. So we need people to monitor these administrative arrangements that are oftentimes responsible for determining this. And I will give a nod to civil resistance and protest. And I know I'm not saying that everyone should be a part of that, but what protest does as it relates to voting rights is protest can trigger a consciousness around a particular issue. And I just want to refer, and it can trigger also legal remedies. And I'll go back to just one example in North Carolina, the NACP versus McCrory case that made its way to the Supreme Court and was won by voting rights groups. I believe that case was partly fueled by protests on the ground around the state's voter suppression bill. So those are some of the things that people can think about when we move forward.
All right, I'm gonna go off script and ask this question because this is something that's very frustrating to me. When I'm around a lot of young people, they will say, what difference does it make? Why should I vote? It's not gonna change anything. I don't like either any of the candidates, so I'm just gonna sit out and not vote. I'll start with Ms. Gallman. Why, this is personally very frustrating to me, but why is this misguided in your viewpoint, if it is?
It's frustrating to me as well. I actually had a nephew that did not vote in the presidential election of 2020. I was in law school at the time, so it was very traumatic for me. And I was very upset with him, and I sat down with him and talked to him. I think the reason why they do not, or I actually know the reason why the younger generation will not vote is because it's the education, and I can't express education enough. Particularly local elections. And once you explain to them how local elections work and how they are so important, and how those are the people that really are making laws, are guiding the laws, they are ruling on cases. That seemed to have gotten him more involved in local elections. Now with the presidential elections and the congressional elections, those are a little harder to explain, but education has really been for me.
Right, Ms. Johnson, you're out there on the front line, you're trying to mobilize people, get them energized. When you have individuals that say, what difference does it make? I don't want to vote, it doesn't make any difference, I don't like any of these people.
So I think that is a very loaded question for several reasons. I always tell people, sometimes you operate from your own point of privilege. And so for me, I get to wake up, get in my car, take my daughter to school, my lights are on, I have food. No, I'm not in a domestic situation. If I was, I have enough money to get out of it. And so I have the capacity, the mental, emotional, physical, and financial capacity to pay attention to what's happening and educate myself on how my vote impacts it. But the average person is living below is living below the poverty threshold, especially in Tennessee. The average person is just trying to get from point A to point B. They're trying to get their kids to school. They're trying to have a good quality of life based on whatever minimal that they can provide. And they don't have the emotional capacity to take on the distress of thinking about what it means to fight the system. And that is kind of where my work has been birthed from. A lot of the work that I do is, while it's steeped in this traditional radical activism, I try to incorporate joy and justice, because to me, I feel like we think that we're fighting for justice. Yes, we are fighting for justice, but when we get justice, what else do we want, right? People want joy. They want to be able to get up, take a vacation, do whatever it is that they self-determine they want to do. And oftentimes when we talk about this fight, especially as advocates, we see it from a place of, here are all the things that are bad. You're going to die. This is going to happen. They're going to take away all your rights. Nobody cares, and people have become numb and immune to that. Because like, as a Black woman on this call, we know as a Black woman, you have a really good chance of dying when you give birth. As a Black man, Dr. Sekou knows nobody cares that he's Dr. Franklin. If the police get behind him, they may shoot him. So we live our lives knowing that death and demise is at the forefront of almost everything we do. And we can't make voting be another conversation around our death and demise. It has to be about, hey, what can I do with my vote? Okay, do you know that there is $1 million sitting right now in the capital spending budget and they're trying to decide how to spend it? Did you vote on that? Do you know that these boards decide this? And those are things that I think can help impact the way people turn out. And when it comes to young people, they just haven't lived long enough, one. And two, even if you look on this call, no offense, I love everybody, I'm probably the youngest person. I don't
I
know
knew you was a
how
lot
old you
younger
are.
than me.
But I'm probably the youngest person, and I'm a millennial. I'm about to be 38 years old. And so I think oftentimes we have conversations about people without having conversations with them.
Yeah.
So I think if we want to get young people to vote, we got to start asking them, what makes you excited? What do you want to see in your community? How can I get you engaged? The unfortunate part about that is because there are tons of people in Tennessee who want to do just that. I can name about 10 organizations. The downside is, organizations like the Equity Alliance, organizations like Free Hearts, organizations like the NAACP, we receive less than 0.1% of funding. It takes almost $100 to get one person to the polls. We got 500,000 people who not even registered to vote, plus another 3 million people who aren't even voting. You do the numbers on that. It takes a lot of money to be able to invest in that. And so I think we have a lot of issues when it comes to young people voting. I'll stop there because I can go on and on about that.
No, and I agree, because I always say, because one of our biggest missions at the YW is our domestic violence shelter, and largely we serve Black and brown people in the shelter. And I will say that that's why they need us, because they are trying to survive. So they need us to advocate for them, because they tell us what they need, and you have to talk to those who are in the audience, you have to talk to those mostly affected. And that's why they need people like us, so that they can we can advocate for them, because they are definitely in survival mode. Dr. Franklin, we're a little bit over, but I want you to get a chance to respond to this.
No, I agree with the other folks. I mean, a lot of the evidence suggests that, you know, if you tell young people the old kind of phrase, when people died for the right to vote, that doesn't necessarily work, because a lot of young people are seeing their friends die through a variety of different reasons. So the nostalgia argument doesn't necessarily work with a lot of young people. I do a voting rights conference, and the youth group kind of trained us on that idea. A lot of times, I think, you know, just, and we have to, I'll say me and the group of folks that I come out of network, we have to do a better job of making these issues plain and connecting real life issues to how they affect young people on a day-to-day basis. How does voting affect your grandmother's diabetes medication costs? I just finished up a project of chicken plant workers in Georgia, low-wage chicken plant workers, and who's president of the United States determines how many chicken plants they're going to cut on an assembly line that is staffed entirely by low-wage Black folks, formerly incarcerated folks, Black women, and people who are marginalized. So literally, who's president will determine if a Black woman gets cartilage damage because she's working on a chicken plant line. But making that more accessible and making that story be part of the voting story, and not just a labor story, but part of the voting story, is something that we, and I say, talk about we, the group of folks that I come out of, have to do a better job of doing. Increasingly, you know, just through my work at MTSU, I put students on the doors. I put them on the doors. We have for 6 years, knocking on the doors, registering people to vote, informing residents about opportunities, class action suits, lawsuits around formerly incarcerated persons, and sending students to school board meetings, local commission meetings, airport commission meetings. And when you do that, it's just they have just a different perspective of what this political process looks like. So those are some of the things that I think could perhaps address what you asked.
All right. Well, thank everyone for this robust conversation today. The individuals here, remember their names. You can volunteer, join, donate to their organization, donate to their cause, because I do know that it is quite a financial burden to move this mission forward, but this mission is important. It's very important that we protect the rights that, and I know it's old school, that people died for, but they did die for these rights, and people to this day are really putting themselves at risk in order to move this forward. I appreciate all of you for taking this time. You have reached audiences that sometimes we traditionally don't reach, and that's what we want to do at the YWCA. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time, and thank you, audience.